good to see you today. It was my, I want to say sophomore year in college. I was living back in Ecuador. It was like a holiday weekend, and we're bored at home. My sister and I were like, let's go do something. Let's go to the movies. A friend of hers wanted to go to, so we go pick her up, and it's pouring down rain, absolutely pouring down rain. And I drove this car that like the AC was broken, it didn't work, and you know how you have the function to like when your windows get like all fogged up, like you turn it on. So that wasn't working either. And our friend kind of lived in like a little bit of like a dangerous part of town. We get lost because we can barely see. We finally find her house. We get there. I just want to get out of there. So I did the wisest thing you could do, which is like, I'm flooring it while it's pouring rain, and I can't see anything because I want to get out of there. And the way the road works is kind of like, it was outskirts of town, so you have this kind of like big two, you know, like southbound lane, northbound lane, me in the middle. But then as you're getting closer into the city, you go, there's like this big circle that you get around, and when you're coming out of the circle, then the road kind of like widens up, so you still have a southbound lane, and then you have kind of like a regular northbound lane and kind of like a service road for you to go to, like, you know, if you live in the area to get out of the road. I forget that, so all of a sudden, like, my medium is moved closer to where I am. I can barely see anything, and my last memory I have of that is like the median is kind of like right in front of me. I can't brake because I'm going way too fast, so all I do is kind of like, you know, try to move my steering wheel as far to the right as I can. The driver's side tire hits the median, the tire explodes, and the car kind of like veers off, and we end up literally like, this is like the ditch end of the road, and our car is like right here. My sister's sitting next to me, her friend is in the back, and it was this moment for me of like, that could have gone way, way worse. Like, I busted a tire, destroyed the transmission of the car, but outside that, like, we're perfectly healthy. And two things always come like strike out to me. One is like, if the median hadn't been in there, I would have swerved straight into oncoming traffic, and then could have been way worse. But the other thing is I end up on the other side of the road, and there wasn't a guardrail on that side. So if my car had gone any faster than it was going, we would have ended up in the ditch. It's fascinating how kind of like roads work, right? Like, you have these guardrails that on one side kind of like protect us from getting hurt. Lack of guardrails can actually be very hurtful or even deadly to some of us. And guardrails are also kind of like helping us stay on the road to where we want to go. Now, we're starting this new series today we're calling Guardrails, because we believe that, if you think about it, life is a journey, which would be a great name for a church. And if life is a journey, chances are that we also need guardrails to help us get to where we want to get without wrecking our lives or hurting ourselves in the process. So with that, I want to invite you to turn with me to the book of Ephesians chapter 4. I'm going to start reading verse 17. It says this: "So I tell you this, and insist on it in the Lord, that you must no longer live as the Gentiles do in the futility of their thinking. They are darkened in their understanding and separated from the life of God because of the ignorance that is in them due to the hardening of their hearts. Having lost all sensitivity, they have given themselves over to sensuality so as to indulge in every kind of impurity, and they are full of greed. That, however, it's not the way of life you learned when you heard about Christ, and we're taught in him in accordance with the truth that is in Jesus. You were taught, with regard to your former way of life, to put off your old self, which is being corrupted by its deceitful desires, to be made new in the attitude of your minds, and to put on the new self, created to be like God in true righteousness and holiness." The city of Ephesus, which is the place that Paul is writing this letter to, it's a very, very cosmopolitan city that you have people from kind of like all over the Roman Empire, which means you end up having all sorts of different cultures and all sorts of different religions that are part of that city. And a few years before this letter, the Apostle Paul actually has lived there, and he starts his church, his community, which is mostly Gentiles, meaning like non-Jewish people that become part of this community. And, they now belong to this part of the larger church that has Gentiles and also has Jewish people. And actually, if you trace the argument that Paul is making throughout the whole letter to the Ephesians, one of the points he's making is that God is kind of in the same way that in Ephesus you have people from all over the empire coming together and being part of a community. That's kind of what God is doing with the church, right? That with the church, God is bringing non-Jewish people and Jewish people of the covenant family of God and people who now have believed in Christ, and they're all coming together and they're starting this new community, this new relationship in the world. And the problem that they end up running into is that all these people that are becoming Christians are Gentiles in Ephesus. Well, they have all sorts of different backgrounds. They have all sorts of different cultural practices. They have all sorts of different perspectives on morality and on ethics. Actually, the Apostle Paul makes the argument that they don't have a perspective on morality and ethics, and that's what kind of like ends up getting into trouble. There's some exceptions, but for the most part, like Greco-Roman culture at the time, it's incredibly indulgent and promiscuous and excessive in all the ways that you can imagine. There's not much self-control that we're talking about a few weeks ago going on in there, right? And kind of like Paul was saying, seems to be here saying, is, hey, just because you became a Christian, a lot of that worldview and practice that you had before, it doesn't just immediately go away. And not only that, but you're living in a system, in a world, in a city that's kind of like going in a completely different direction that you're going. So kind of like the system is working against you in terms of like the temptations that you're exposed to and the excesses going on. And Paul is trying to kind of like make this point that there is this tension that's very similar, honestly, to the tension that we looked at when we were doing the Summer Fruit series a few weeks ago in the book of Galatians, between indulging what he calls the desires of our sinful nature versus surrendering to the work of the Spirit of God. And here he's using this metaphor of clothing, right? He's kind of like, you had that old self, that old way of living. He's going to like take that off. And then he's saying, put on the new way of living, which is the way of the Spirit working in you. And if you keep reading the rest of the chapter, he goes into this long list of do's and don'ts, right? And it's like, don't lie, but you have to speak truthfully. And he says, like, don't steal, but you have to be, a hard worker and be generous. And stuff that for all of us would seem pretty obvious, right? He talks about interpersonal relationships, he talks about sexual ethics, even talks about speech, about how we talk to one another. And it's all great, except that, if I'm honest with you for a second, when I read passages like that, I get a little nervous myself. I start having like a little bit of anxiety. And the reason why is because I can see how reading passages like this, if you're outside of Christianity, and honestly sometimes even if you're inside of Christianity, you can end up thinking that Christianity is just this legalistic set of rules, right? Of do's and don'ts, things that you should do, things that you shouldn't do. And at least for me, the anxiety that I always feel when I read passages like this is that I start being afraid of everything, right? Like I can sin if I say things in the wrong tone of voice, I'm sinning. If I had, the wrong thought, if I, look at somebody, whatever area of life you can think about, all of a sudden you're feeling this anxiety. Am I sinning all the time when I'm going to this? God mad at me all the time, right? And honestly, no wonder then that you end up with certain kind of like sects within Christianity that become super legalistic about everything. Like if everything is a danger to sin, well, it kind of makes sense. Let's just stay away from everything, right? So don't listen to secular music and don't go to movies and you can only watch VeggieTales. Not that that's ever happened to me or anybody here, right? And you probably know people like that. Maybe you grew up in churches or in households that kind of like thought about life like that. And I say all this just to make this point, right? We're doing a series about guardrails, which just to be honest, is basically about how do we set up healthy boundaries in certain areas of our lives that can keep us from basically wrecking our lives and kind of like orient our lives towards the life that God wants to have for us. I believe in that. I think that's good that what we're doing this series. But I don't want this to become a source of anxiety and worry and guilt and shame. The point of this is not to burden you with all these to-dos and don'ts. Jesus says, my yoke is easy and my burden is light. The reason why we're doing this series is because we believe that guardrails are actually good for us, that they're life-giving, and more importantly, even though it might sound a little counterintuitive, that guardrails are actually means to freedom. That guardrails leads us to freedom and to living a full and expansive life. So what I want to do for the next few minutes, I want to draw your attention to a couple of ideas in these two chapters, chapter kind of like 4 and 5 in Ephesians, that I think help us see how guardrails can be good for us. I kind of get an idea of where Paul is coming from. So with that, let me take you to verse 26. In your anger, do not sin. Do not let the sun go down while you are still angry, and do not give the devil a foothold. So Paul is writing this letter and he's giving them all these sorts of do's and don'ts in different areas of life. And for most of the things, he's very categorical. Like, don't do this, this is bad, do this, right? It's interesting to me how he thinks about anger, though, because he says, in your anger, do not sin. And the implication of that is that in and of itself, anger is not sinful. So like, if you get angry, like, you can get angry, that's not sinful. But then he seems to be saying that being angry can somehow lead to sin, right? And I'll be honest, I don't know what he's talking about because that's never happened to me. I've never been angry and said something I regret to people I love or care about in my life. So, and just like you don't either. So this is incredibly relevant for us. But let's keep reading just for the sake of time since it's Sunday and we're at church, okay? Then he says, do not let the sun go down while you're still angry, and do not give the devil a foothold, which is a fascinating connection of ideas because I honestly think that this passage has sometimes been misinterpreted, right? How many of you have been taught maybe some version of basically the whole point of this is like, if you get angry, you have to figure it out before you go to bed, right? And not doing that, going to bed angry, that's the sin, right? So if you have an argument with your spouse or a family member or a friend, you got to square it away before you go to bed or like don't fall asleep so you're not in trouble, right? Now the thing is that if you're a human being, you know that's not always how this stuff works, right? Like there's certain things that we can get over pretty quickly. Sometimes we can want to get over them pretty quickly. And then you wake up the next morning and you're like doing this, you're like, I can't believe he said that. And then you're like stabbing a piece of meat and you're like, why am I so, again, never happened to me, right? But how many times maybe we've been pushed to forgiving someone or kind of like putting on the facade that we've gotten over something without necessarily even processing it because we don't want to sin and go to bed later. Or maybe, how many times, let's be honest for a second, have we manipulated a person in our lives to kind of let it go and move on and forget about it using a passage like this? Because you shouldn't go to bed angry, so forgive me. I'm sorry I did that, but forgive me, right? Now, I don't want to sound like I'm talking against forgiveness or against dealing with conflict. I'm just not 100% sure that this is what Paul is getting at. I actually think that what's going on here is that Paul is giving us a picture of what a guardrail looks like. The thing that Paul is saying is this. You know how when you get angry, you end up saying and doing things that hurt people around you and that you regret later? Again, doesn't apply to us, never happened to anybody here. And then he kind of like offers this practice. He says, do not let the sun go down in your anger. And the reason why he's offering this practice is because of what he says next. He says, do not give the devil a foothold. I think the implication of this passage is that if we don't deal with our anger and we let it fester, it opens us up to temptation of one sort or another. In the words of the ancient theologian from a galaxy far, far away, fear is a path to the dark side. You know, fear leads to anger. Anger leads to hate. Hate leads to suffering. Which takes me to my first point. Guardrails are meant to protect us. Okay? I'm not sure that the point Paul is making is if you are angry and if you go to bed angry, you're sinning. I think the point Paul is trying to make is you have to protect your heart from anger taking root. And you have to deal with the issues making you angry as soon as you can. And don't let it fester. Which, by the way, is something that echoes the teachings of Jesus. So go back to the Gospel of Matthew. Jesus is saying this. You have heard that our ancestors were told, you must not murder. If you commit murder, you're subject to judgment. But I say, if you are even angry with someone, you're subject to judgment. If you call someone an idiot, you're in danger of being brought before the court. So that's all of us right now. If you curse someone, you're in danger of the fires of hell. Now, I don't have time to get into like the whole, ins and outs of this passage, except to say this. It seems that for Jesus, you can actually draw a line between anger and murder. And that's a big distance, right? But apparently, says you can draw a line, and that line goes through the human heart. And I think that Paul knows this. I would argue, I wonder if Paul has experiences. If you know anything about the life of Paul, before Paul becomes a Christian, Paul is this zealot who persecutes Christians. And who persecutes Christians not only kind of like trying to get them arrested, he hates Christians. He wants Christians executed. And he's kind of like devoting his life for it. And actually, even now that he's a Christian, you read some of the passages that he read, he wants to lay some holy hands to some people, right? Like the dude can get angry. And what I think is going on, I could be wrong, but what I think is going on is that Paul has instituted a guardrail in his own life that he knows that he's prone to anger, and he knows where that anger can lead. So whenever he's angry at somebody, it looks to me like he tries as much as he can to deal with the issue before he goes to bed. And he's sort of like sharing this practice with the church of Ephesus. At the beginning of this passage, Paul is making this juxtaposition between how Christians ought to live and how Gentiles live. And he says something interesting. Back in verse 19, he says, having lost all sensitivity, they have given themselves over to sensuality as to indulge in every kind of impurity. It seems to me that Paul is saying that one of the core distinctions between Christians and Gentiles is that Gentiles, he says, are desensitized. Meaning that their hearts have given over to whatever it is that they've given over themselves to. That kind of like incremental changes don't seem like a big deal to them anymore. When something takes root in our hearts, it clouds our judgment and it clouds our actions. And if we connect this with the teachings of Jesus in Matthew about anger, I think that part of the connection here is that when someone lets anger take root in their heart, then all of a sudden your heart starts moving so that contempt for the person that you're angry with doesn't seem like a big deal. And then you keep letting that fester, and all of a sudden contempt can turn into hate for the person that you're angry with. And if you don't check with that, you let that fester, all of a sudden murder doesn't seem like that big of a departure. Guardrails are meant to keep us from getting to that point. And I don't think this only applies to anger. I think that applies to whatever fill in the blank thing you want to think, fill in the blank sin you want to think about. Guardrails are meant to protect us from derailing our lives when sin takes root in our heart. So that's one of the things that I think guardrails are meant to do. Now, I think there's a second purpose to guardrails that's, I would argue, even more important. So let's go over to the next chapter in Ephesians, chapter 5. I'm going to start reading on verse 8. Paul's talking, he says, for you were once in darkness, but now you're light in the Lord. Live as children of light. Paul is giving these do's and don'ts to people, telling people to set guardrails in their lives. And I think that here he's actually getting us to the why we should want to set guardrails in our lives. Paul starts saying, you used to live like pagan Gentiles, but that's not who you are anymore. And then he uses this incredible metaphor. He says, you were once darkness, but then says, but now you are light in the Lord. He doesn't even say you're in the light. He says, you are light. Verse 9 says, for the fruit of the light consists in all goodness, righteousness, and truth. Find out what pleases the Lord. Have nothing to do with the fruitless deeds of darkness, but rather expose them. It is shameful even to mention what the disobedient do in secret. So he's connecting this idea of the fruit of the Spirit, saying that the fruit of being in the light is goodness and righteousness and truth. He talks about moving away from the darkness. And then he says this incredibly beautiful thing in verse 13. He says, but everything exposed by the light becomes visible, and everything that is illuminated becomes alive. That is why it is said, wake up, sleeper, rise from the dead, and Christ will shine on you. Which I think that last part is actually quoting from a hymn. What I want you to notice in this whole section is this. Paul is adamant about setting guardrails because he believes that the people that he's writing to were meant for more than living in the darkness. He actually thinks that they were meant to live in the light. What Paul is doing, you remember we talked about guardrails. We said one of the things that guardrails do is like protect us. But the other thing that guardrails do, if you think about it, is kind of like help us stray away from the road, from the destination that we want to get to. The key element in guardrails, and we'll talk about this a little bit more, is that for guardrails to make sense, they make sense because they help us get to a destination. The question then is, what is the destination? Where do we want to go? Like philosophers call this the telos, the end goal. What is the end goal of our lives? where do we want to get to? Guardrails, when we don't have a telos, when we don't have a goal, guardrails kind of like don't make sense, right? Because you should be able to go wherever. If you want to get somewhere, you kind of like need something to delineate the road. What Paul is saying is, this is the telos, this is the end goal for you. You are meant to be lights in the world. That's what God created you for. This is the goal to which we should aim. And then he even goes further and he starts connecting this idea of being light with the idea of Christ when he shines his light on us. He brings us to life. Guardrails are meant to be life-giving. As I said earlier, the issue that we sometimes run into a topic like this is that it can feel very restrictive. That God doesn't want us to have any fun. Or if you want to give it more extreme, that God doesn't want us to enjoy life. We tend to equate piety with sacrifice and with self-denial. But you look at the Bible, the rest of the Bible thought the opposite of that. Jesus himself says on John 10:10, the thief comes only to steal and kill and destroy. And then he says, I have come that they may have life and have it to the full. I would argue that guardrails are not just about setting boundaries and constraints, that guardrails are actually about freedom. Let me ask, well, how? Well, because I think that one of the big problems in our culture today is that we have a fundamental misunderstanding of what freedom is. We live in a highly individualistic culture where our highest value is self-actualization. A few weeks ago, when we were talking about the fruit of self-control, we looked at this idea that a sociologist had coined called Project Self. And I use this definition that I borrowed from John Tyson in New York City. That's this. Project Self, he says, is the idea that society exists as a blank canvas for my own self-definition, expression, and enjoyment. If this is how we think about life, we're going to think of freedom primarily as getting rid of any constraints that get in the way of my self-definition, expression, and enjoyment. One of my favorite books I've read in recent years is a book On the Road with St. Augustine by James K. Smith. James K. Smith is a philosophy professor at Calvin College in Grand Rapids, Michigan, but he's also kind of like a St. Augustine nerd. And what he did in this book is he wrote this list of essays on different topics and kind of looked at like some of the teachings from St. Augustine, the writings of St. Augustine, and how they kind of like help us make sense of these topics. Now, St. Augustine, if you don't know who he's a theologian and philosopher and the Bishop of Hippo. He lived between the 4th and 5th centuries, and he's this incredibly influential church father. Some of the most profound writings in Christianity are his. Like, we think that the idea of the modern biography is invented by him in his Confessions. Like an incredibly influential Christian. And one of the essays in the book that I read was on the idea of freedom and how Augustine's understanding of freedom sort of like evolves from his youth to when he becomes a Christian. And here we see that this idea of freedom that we're talking about here, that's freedom from constraints of any sorts. That's how Augustine thought about freedom originally. Augustine kind of like grows up, his mom is Christian, his dad isn't, and he's sent off to Carthage to learn, and basically it's the equivalent of like going to college, right? And when he remembers his life, he says that when he goes to Carthage, he just like parties it up like it's 1999. Or at that point, it would be like parties it up like it's, I don't know, like the first century, who knows? Anyway, he just lets go, okay? And he's partying around, doing all sorts of things, and indulging in everything that you can imagine. And James K. Smith says that that's kind of like what Augustine comes to call like freedom from, right? We want freedom from any constraints. We want freedom from anybody telling us what to do. And anything that feels like it's somebody telling us what to do, it feels oppressive, it feels repressive, it feels wrong. So just to quote him explain, he says, this notion of freedom is the only freedom we know now. Freedom as self-determination. The freedom to decide what is my own good is enshrined in Justice Anthony Kennedy's majority opinion in Planned Parenthood versus Casey. At the heart of liberty is the right to define one's own concept of existence, of meaning, of the universe, and of the mystery of human life. Freedom means hands off. I've got this. I know what I want. I'll know I'm free when I get to decide what's good for me, when every choice is a blank check of opportunity and possibility. And the problem with that is that anybody who's ever struggled with a bad habit or a vice or an addiction is going to tell you it's incredibly easy for us to lose control. and to veer towards bad habits and excess and abuse. From eating, drinking, work, sex, whatever you want. The problem with that is that those things then tie us down and hinder us from living the life that we want to live. Ask anybody who struggles with alcoholism if they feel free. Actually, let me tell you something completely different. Ask somebody who doesn't have good work, family life guardrails if he or she is thriving in their relationship with their friends and family. By the way, this is exactly how Augustine starts feeling. That freedom from, in and of itself, becomes a jail that's trapping him in his own passions and vices. A few paragraphs later, James K. Smith says this. What's emerging here, talking about like Augustine's picture, isn't just an admission of failure. Rather, it's a problem of getting exactly what you want. In the reframing of his experiences, Augustine comes to a radically different way of thinking about freedom. When you've been eaten up by your own freedom and realize the loss of guardrails only meant ending up in the ditch, you start to wonder whether freedom is all it's cracked up to be, or whether freedom might be something other than the absence of constraint and the multiplication of options. To read Augustine in the 21st century is to gain a vantage point that makes all of our freedom look like addiction. When we imagine freedom only as negative freedom, freedom from constraint, hands-off liberty to choose what I want, then our so-called freedom is actually inclined to captivity. When freedom is mere voluntariness without further orientation of goals, then my choice is just another means by which I'm trying to look for satisfaction. Insofar as I keep choosing to try to find that satisfaction in finite created things, whether it's sex or adoration or beauty or power, I'm going to be caught in a cycle where I'm more and more disappointed in those things and more dependent on those things. I keep choosing things with diminishing returns. And when that becomes habitual and eventually necessary, then I forfeit my ability to choose that thing has me now. Which, by the way, this is the original lie. This is the serpent tempting humanity saying the limit, the boundary, the guardrail of don't eat from the fruit, it's robbing you of something. It's robbing you of enjoyment. It's robbing you of freedom. It's robbing you of life. And of course, we know that going past that guardrail only leads to death. I would argue that Jesus offers us a different kind of freedom. There's something in the quote from Jim K. Smith that I think it's important. He says, when freedom is mere voluntariness without further orientation of goals. You know one of the reasons why we're like so living the amount of excess that we live? Because we don't know where we want to go. So we just want to be happy. Well, maybe happiness means doing more of this or doing more of that or expending more or having more relationships, whatever. And our lives ends up being turned into all these different directions because we don't know where to want to go. But when you have a telos, when you have an end goal in mind, then freedom becomes the ability to pursue that goal. What Jesus does is that Jesus comes, and the many things that Jesus does, Jesus comes to show us the telos. Jesus comes to show us the goal. You were not created just to go into whatever many different directions you want. You were created for a relationship with your Heavenly Father. And when you realize that, well then, the point of guardrails is to help you get to that. And then you realize that a lot of the so-called freedoms that we have are getting in the way of that. That I want to go that way, and then this bad habit or this bad relationship or this addiction is actually keeping me from getting there. I want all of a sudden to have some sort of guardrails that help me get to the place I want to get. And that a lot of times feels like self-denial. It seems like imposing limits, but those limits are good because they're helping me get to the direction that I want to get. Years ago, I heard a message by Tim Keller, and Tim Keller was talking about the idea that, if you put a piano in front of somebody that's never had any piano lessons, they're not that free to play that piano. You think they are, like you can play whatever key you want, but if you're trying to play like a piece by Mozart, you're not free at all. You know what you need to gain the freedom to play the piano the way it's meant to be played? You need constraints. You need to learn how to play. You need to make the time to learn how to play. You need the discipline to practice, and it might take years. And you know what? It usually takes saying no to other things. so that you can gain the skills and the knowledge to be able to do with the piano what you want to do. And at some point, all of those constraints are going to lead you to the place that you can look at the music in front of you and you can actually make it happen in the piano. The right type of constraints, the right type of boundaries, the right type of guardrails, they lead to freedom and they lead to life. Jesus says, whoever loses their life for my sake will find it. Remember, when we did the self-control message, I brought this quote from John Mark Comer. Following Jesus is 1,000 small deaths that lead to one massive life. Now the question, what does this look like? Just very, very, very briefly. Go with me to verse 15 on Ephesians chapter 5. It says, then be very careful then how you live. Not as unwise, but as wise, making the most of every opportunity because the days are evil. Therefore, do not be foolish, but understand what the Lord's will is. Do not get drunk on wine, which leads to debauchery. Instead, be filled with the Spirit. I think that there's 3 things here that Paul is giving us that help us understand how to set boundaries in our lives and why we need to set boundaries. The first one is this. He says, be careful then how you live. There's a level of intentionality to what you do. Okay? You've maybe heard the saying, like, if you fail to plan, you plan to fail, which I think is incredibly cheesy, but there's a point. You know what the point of this is? You cannot be careful after the fact. If you think about your greatest regret, the thing that you wish you had a time machine and go back and undo because of the damage that caused, the pain that caused, and maybe the pain that caused to other people, you know you cannot be careful after the fact. The point of guardrails is to not do something before things go off the rails. It's to create limits, and you create limits in the safe zone, not in the danger zone. You create limits in the safe zone so you cannot go off the rails. Now, the second thing he says then is this. He says, be careful then how you live, not as unwise, but as wise. He's saying be wise. And the point here is that there's a discernment, okay? Guardrails, and this is probably one of the key things to understand, right? We tend to think about life in terms of right and wrong. And even in church, right? Like we tend to think about life in terms of like what's sinful and what's not sinful. And some people kind of like, okay, if it's not sinful, I want to stay away from sinful stuff as much as possible. If we're honest, some of us, maybe most of us, the way we think is, how much can I get away with before it's sinful? And we want to live as close to the edge because we think what's in that edge is I'm going to have fun. I'm not going to have enough fun that I'm going to hell or I'm going to like do something bad, but I'm going to try to have as much fun as I can. And we try to live on that edge. So we think, how much can I enjoy, spend, drink, smoke, eat, watch, text, flirt? How many fights can I get into? How mean can I be before this is wrong? And I would argue that sometimes it's not things that seem bad, right? Some of us, that our problem is that we work too much. The question is, how many dance recitals and how many games can I miss before it creates a problem at home? Wisdom, I would argue, asks a different question. And the question that wisdom asks is this: is this the best decision I can make right now? Meaning, if I'm honest with myself, if I do say, act this way, what's more likely to happen as a result? Andy Stanley says that this is a pastor in Atlanta. He says this: in light of your, talking about wisdom, in light of your past experience, your current circumstances, and your future hopes and dreams, what is the wise thing for you to do? You keep reading the passage, and Paul says this: because the days are evil. That's an important thing for us to understand about guardrails. There is resistance. You know what? One of the problems that we don't realize when we think about these topics is that we tend to think about most of the issues that can get us in trouble in life as inherently neutral, which I would argue they are. I would argue that most of the things that we have are inherently good, right? God gives us money, and God gives us relationships and work and sex. Like all the things that we have are gifts from God. And the way we think about it is like, if I don't do something wrong with it, it's fine. The problem is that that's not how the rest of the world thinks about it. So let's use money, for example, right? Let's say that you want to be wise with your money, and that you want to like give and be generous, and then you want to overspend, and then you want to like get into debt and whatever. You know what the problem with that is? You can think that all you want, except that Every single force of marketing and research and psychology in the world has been designed to get you to spend more. Every single second that we are on any sort of device is designed to get us to click something and buy it, right? I know that because I bought my cell phone case because I kept getting an Instagram ad about it. And I love it, but maybe I shouldn't have, right? Okay, so like, and it's about everything. So we can think, oh, I just need to kind of like not do anything about my money. But what you don't realize is the whole world is working against you for that. And that goes in for anything, right? We spend so much time on our phones because there's people that went to school for like 20 years that learn how to design algorithms that appeal to the pleasure centers of our brain so that every time we click on something, we feel good about ourselves. And I know that because I play Monopoly Go, and I play too much Monopoly Go. Okay, you know my point? Like, we talk about these things, and we think in these ways, but the whole thing is like working against us, which means that we need to start guardrails to survive that. I told you the story of my accident. What I didn't tell you is that when I had that almost accident, like almost I was fine, but the car got messed up. I was in this really weird time in my life. In a way, things were great. I was in college. I was in the worship band at church that my dad had planted. I ended up becoming a DJ at a Christian radio station because I spoke English. So I was like the Friday night guys that played all the cool like American Christian music. So I was flipping, pulling DC Talk and the lyrics and stuff like that. And it's the farthest I probably have ever been from God as well. I was kind of like hanging out with the wrong crowd, and I was partying every week, and I was probably developing a drinking problem, all sorts of things, right? And all throughout that weekend, like, there's a longer story I can share when you like, all throughout that weekend, God had been working in my heart. And then when we had that accident, after that, I was talking with my dad, and we were praying. I had this deep sense that God saved our lives. That accident could have ended up in a way worse way than it ended. And that for me was this pivotal moment in my spiritual journey. I said, I don't want to go where this is going. I want to go towards God. God, in a way, created this guardrail moment where I hit this guardrail to draw me to Him. You know why? Because He wants me. And because He wants me to have life. And because He knows that the only place I'm going to experience life is with Him. And I think that that's what God wants for you. So I want to invite you to do something a little bit different to this, so we're close to this message. I want to invite you to stand up and get your communion kit because I'm going to have communion in a second. Chances are in a room this size that for some of you this message can feel a little bit like worried and oppressive and, oh man, this is all more legalistic rules. And we talked about it a little bit. Maybe for some of you, you're actually hearing this and you're filled with regret and with guilt and with shame because of mistakes that you made in the past because you didn't have those guardrails set up. And you're just sad right now. You're like, man, I wish I could go back and do this again. Maybe some of you today, you're hooked on some habit or vice or addiction. And you're like, I wish I could just don't know how to break free from it. What I want you to do this morning is I want to invite you to think about this in a different way because I think that, God invites us into this life as a gift to give us life. And the guardrails that we're invited to set up in our own lives are not meant to be oppressive, are meant to be life-giving. So I want you to close your eyes for a second and extend your hands in front and maybe have your palms up like this. And I want you to imagine whatever the feelings that you have, whether it's like you're worried, it sounds oppressive, I don't know, I'm concerned, maybe it's the guilt, the shame, the regret, maybe it's the fear, the worry, the weariness, the tiredness, and if we're honest, it feels heavy, it feels like this heavy burden. I want to read this to you from Matthew 11:28. Then Jesus said, come to me, all of you who are weary and carry heavy burdens, and I will give you a rest. And I want you to imagine that somebody comes and you see hands pick up that heavy burden that's in your hands. I take them away. And instead of that, they're placing a pillow. It's very light. And it's easy to carry. And hear this. Take my yoke upon you. Let me teach you. Because I am humble and gentle at heart. and you will find rest for your souls. For my yoke is easy to bear, and the burden I give you is light. Jesus is inviting you into this life not alone, but with Him. And because of that, you can do this. And it's easy to do.